which we're going to discuss level of service versus vehicle miles traveled when doing traffic studies. Traffic studies?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's the transition from level of service to vehicle
Oh, did I get
miles
it backwards?
traveled. Yeah, there's no verses here. It's state law, SB743. Yeah.
I'm just looking for a fight, I guess, tonight. Okay. Hello.
Hey, good evening. I'm Piskowski, Principal Planner with Development Services. So tonight we have a presentation regarding the city's implementation of Senate Bill 743, which is the transition from LOS, level of service, to VMT, vehicles miles traveled, as the metric for transportation analysis under CEQA. With me tonight are Brian Manford and Megan Weir from Nelson Nygaard Consultant Associates, who are contracted with the city to assist us in this transition from LOS to VMT. A presentation has been prepared to inform and educate both your commission as well as the public regarding this transition, which is again required by state law. We are not making any decision tonight. It's purely educational. And we're here to explain what SB 743 is, how it's compared, or how comparing LS to VMT and the changes between the two, and also the work that we have to do in the upcoming months. So now I'll turn it over to both Megan and Brian.
Thank you. I'm Megan Weir with Nelson Nygaard, here with Brian Manford, and we are going to walk you through some of the SB 743 basics. So quickly about Nelson Nygaard, we're a transportation planning consulting company. We work with cities, counties, transit agencies, all sorts of different areas related to getting people around and solving mobility and access issues. So policy reform and policy that supports multimodal networks is part of the work that we do. And our agenda for this presentation is an overview of what Senate Bill 743 requires, comparison of LOS and VMT to have a sense of where we were and where we're moving, how mitigations will change if we take LOS out of CEQA review, and what implementation looks like, and we are saving plenty of time for questions and discussion. So to get started, SB 743 changes the requirements for how to measure transportation impacts in CEQA. Right now, CEQA requires analysis of a project's environmental impacts, including transportation, as I'm sure all of you are familiar. And SB 743 requires cities to evaluate transportation impacts with metrics that, these are the three key tenets of SB 743, to use metrics that support a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, support development of multimodal transportation networks, and support diverse land uses or diversification of land uses. Cities have until July 1st, 2020 to comply with SB 743. And level of service, which is the current metric, can no longer be used to measure transportation impacts under CEQA. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about the differences between what LOS and VMT measures, but specifically LOS is not a metric that supports the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, development of multimodal networks, and diversification of land uses. And so the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR, has recommended that lead CEQA agencies replace LOS with vehicle miles traveled per capita. And other cities have already adopted this. Some of the cities that were first to adopt this are Pasadena, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, and Los Angeles. Some of their process started before the technical advisory was shared from OPR, and now many cities across the state are following suit. And I'm going to pass this over to Brian to talk about the differences here.
Thank you. Hello, thanks. So
It's the first time I think that's happened. Mike is not telling us.
So level of service is something that we're familiar with from past environmental reviews. And what it does is it measures automobile delay, which we think of as traffic or convenience, how easy it is to drive. And it's graded on a letter grade from A to F, which we're also familiar with from school. A is usually thought of as good, that's free-flowing vehicles, and F is thought of as bad, where you have delays at intersections and on highways. But when we think about the environmental impacts of that and being the measurement, it's a little bit more challenging because it's only measuring vehicle delay. It's not measuring how many people are in a vehicle. It's not measuring how hard it is to cross the street in a walker. It's not measuring other aspects of transportation analysis that are important. And so therefore, OPR has, or the SB743 is requiring that we no longer use LOS for lead agencies. And instead are recommending that cities use vehicle miles traveled. And one way to think of this is LOS measures traffic and VMT measures how much travel a project would cause. So they're subtly different, and one of the ways that the VMT is different is that it's based on geographic travel patterns that are related to the level of infrastructure provided, transit service, and land use, and therefore it better connects to the greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, because some projects are going to cause more travel than other projects. And the way it's calculated on a per capita level is the total household VMT divided by the total population to produce the household VMT per capita. And that is used for residential projects. For employment, such as office land use projects, you use the home to work trip, the total employment VMT per worker divided by the total number of workers to get the employment VMT per capita, which are the two key metrics. And what switching from measuring the traffic to measuring VMT allows a city to do is remove barriers to infill development, which can support local goals such as the downtown specific plan. It can be easier to model than LOS because you're able to produce tools to model it rather than having to model every single project. And from a technical perspective, what's leading the VMT is the California Air Resource Board's. They mapped out the greenhouse gas emissions modeling that would be required in order to achieve California's greenhouse gas reduction goals that are the spirit of SB 743 or the justification. And so that's where the VMT allows that modeling to be done, which is why it's recommended as a metric. That said, measuring traffic is still very important. I think we all know that, and therefore LOS can still be used in a city's development review process, but it can't be used in CEQA. And so other cities such as San Jose and Pasadena have adopted a separate local transportation analysis that allows for intersection operational analysis to ensure that it's functional and that there's site access without having it be within CEQA. And now Megan will finish.
Thanks. So if we're not measuring impacts or LOS impacts within CEQA, we're using vehicle miles traveled per capita or vehicle miles traveled per employee instead, then that means that the findings within CEQA are going to be different and they're no longer going to be tied to LOS, and the mitigations will therefore also be different. And so of course, the question comes up, how can we mitigate VMT? If VMT per capita is so tied to the existing land use patterns and transportation networks, then how can we mitigate VMT? And the answer is that VMT mitigations over the long term lead to more smart growth patterns. And there are a lot of tools in the toolbox that are available. Most are what we refer to as transportation demand management strategies, TDM. And those can be incentive programs and to make it easier for people to use transit, to change parking management, and improve the walkable public environment. And there's also land use changes, having a greater mix of land uses and more density can reduce VMT, and then parking management specifically to incentivize people to make different decisions when it comes to driving and parking. And so one important thing to note is that all of those things are also supportive. They reduce VMT because they are supportive of giving people more choices so that they can travel around without having to drive in a vehicle everywhere. And so TDM programs and land use changes also support reducing the LOS impacts, which is a nice benefit, even though LOS is no longer a part of CEQA. So this slide just has a few more examples of some of the specific TDM mitigations that are being considered. Connections to transit, increasing affordable housing, commute trip reduction programs, and so on. And so this is really high level. We're going to get, the next few months, we're going to get into exactly what it takes to implement this, but for now, at the overview level, what does it take to comply with SB 743? There's two key areas: what needs to change within CEQA and what needs to happen outside of CEQA. Within CEQA, the city needs to select new metrics to analyze impacts, no longer LOS within CEQA, establish a screening process and thresholds of significance, so really define how those metrics are going to be used, and identify mitigation measures so that if there is a finding of impact, of significant impact, then we know what the process is to mitigate it. Outside of CEQA, the city will need to revise the process for analyzing mobility conditions, and that's what the example of what Pasadena and San Jose have done is identify their own requirements for local transportation analysis that's separate from CEQA so that they can still gather information about traffic operations, and then determine what metrics to maintain for non-CEQA local analysis purposes, and consider other complementary policy changes to parking and TDM ordinances that will help support this transition to VMT per capita and still meet all of the local operational needs. And this is a schedule overview. We've started off by reviewing the existing framework policies and goals, and we're talking to people across multiple different departments within the city to get a clear understanding of what kind of analysis questions come up and what policies are already in place that will support this transmission or transition. And then we're currently reviewing VMT analysis tools and case studies, and VTA has recently released their VMT per capita data for all of Santa Clara County. And we're looking at that along with the similar modeled data that we've seen from MTC. And what's coming up next is defining the new transportation analysis approach within CEQA, including the specific metrics and the thresholds of significance. And we'll come back to the Planning Commission with those recommendations, and then develop policy revision and guidelines to put that, fully implement that into place, and then consider complementary policy changes that will further support the transition. That's it, so we'll take questions.
Commissioners?
Yep.
Yes.